So maybe just a little bit of background before I start. We, in the police service, we were asked by our national command group, which basically focused specifically on how to deal with the COVID regulations in terms of the Disaster Management Act. And in the process of enforcing the regulations, they also monitored what happened to crime, as they would do during any other normal circumstances in one of the platforms. So they noticed that, for instance, there was a major drop in crime, and logic tells us that this has to do with maybe the fact that people were at home and there were less opportunities for crime, and so on and so on. But being from research, we also questioned the reasons why they would ask that and just simply assume that it was due to the COVID regulations and the way that the police enforced the regulations. So we were then asked to do the research, and that research involved crime statistics and it involved case docket analysis. But more than that, we also wanted to know exactly what has been done by other departments and in civil society that might have influenced the levels of crime within the country. So that is the background. I will go on to the slides just so that I can introduce the team as well. The study wasn't done by the police service. We facilitated interviews and we assisted with some administrative functions, but most of that was done by our team. And just as a reminder, in terms of the case study that we had, the focus for us was to review the impact of SAP's policing efforts as frontline law enforcement during the COVID-19 pandemic, to determine whether or not the SAPs effectively managed to enforce the state of disaster regulations while executing its mandate to ensure that all inhabitants in South Africa are and feel safe. Now, that was a major issue for many people, as we had different responses to the enforcement by the police service. So we with the assistance of Gtac and the NIF, we got a team of researchers together, and we conducted more or less from August to 31st of March this year. We were involved in planning and interviews that we held. From the police service, all the researchers were also ethically cleared to conduct a study on us based on the experience, field of experience, and the status within the academic environment. And then also we had the methodology that we followed qualitatively, and mostly through virtual and telephone interviews. A total of 101 interviews were conducted, and that includes participants from a national level, provincial level, local level, private institutions, NGOs, and FBOs, faith-based organizations. So that is our team. Independent researchers and academics from different universities participated, and we are very grateful for this, because we simply did not have the capacity for such a study, and we know that our researchers also found it very challenging to push through with the study, especially at the later stage when the universities started to open their registrations again. And there was also a time during exams that they did it. And so, yes, from the police service side, we couldn't have done it without this team. So what did we do? We conducted the studies, and we based our instruments on the chapters of the report that we anticipated. And they will see that it goes on to focus on national government and provincial responses, leadership, governance, and decision making. And most of the chapters you will see corresponds with what we have in the national report and the focus of even the provincial report. So I highlight some of the themes that emerged. Obviously, chapter 1 deals with the methodology and so on. And the rationale for the study. But chapter 2, we focused on national government and provincial responses. Themes that emerged very strongly there was that the amendments to the regulations created confusion and was very often misinterpreted by the law enforcers. And it's sometimes not necessarily the amendment to the regulations, but perhaps more the frequency of the regulations or the amendments to these regulations. So if they're not very well informed or kept updated in terms of the law, at station level, frontliners would continue enforcing regulations that might be outdated. Then also, again, we had numerous coordinating structures, and some of them were utilized alongside joint operational centers. We know that the joint operational centers and intelligence centers, they followed from the National Command Center. And there we had quite a number of important decisions taken, and then it was escalated down to your operational levels. But we had some structures created specifically to deal with the enforcement of regulations and monitoring COVID-related issues within provinces. But what did surface was the centrality of the joint operational and intelligence structures, or the joint operational centers. Now, the joint operational and intelligence structures dealt with sensitive issues where there's more intelligence involved. For instance, one would not just necessarily focus on enforcing COVID regulations, but one would also have to look at the impact of the regulations on border policing. What would happen on one, your marine borders, and also on the other side, your land borders? How do you enforce that? So on the other hand, you had the joint operational centers, and at these centers were also opened to accommodate NGOs and other departments within government to share their experience and the input in terms of strategies to be followed and so on. So the key thing here was that, and we heard that before, that there were quite a number of structures in place, of which the joint operational and intelligence structures and the JOC surfaced as central. Enforcement challenges came as a result of the fact that there was no blueprint for the situation we were in. If we think in terms of the Soccer World Cup 2010, we had an unusual circumstance where the economy was growing, the spirit was high, there was no real restriction on movement and so on. It basically was just in the area where teams practiced and so on, and on match day near the stadiums where the teams would play. But crime was low during that period. But now, during the COVID-19, we experienced the same thing, that crime was a little bit lower, but there were other factors such as restriction on movement, ban on the sale of liquor and tobacco, for instance. So there was nothing for us really to go back and learn from. So it was almost like a trial and error thing. The further we went into the pandemic in the enforcement, the better it became. But then again, when it was stricter enforcement or regulations, it was easier to police than when the levels of restriction were eased. For instance, level 4, level 3, there were more movement, and that created challenges in terms of enforcement of the regulations. When we go to the leadership, governance, and decision making, again, there one would see the chain of command that was, in some cases for the police, long-established structures. In other words, information or decisions could flow from the National Command Center to the NAT joint or the NAT JOCs, from there to the police structure established for monitoring COVID, and that was a National Core Command Group. And from there, they could issue instructions and guidance to provinces. And at provinces, they would have a prof joint or a prof JOC, where they could interpret those instructions and guidance, and again cascade that through to the districts, to clusters, and at stations. At stations, they still had the operational command centers where they focused on crime, specific crimes, and, for instance, gang-related activities. So there was an established line of communication and authority within the existing structures within the police. The effectiveness of leadership and governance and decision-making depended, unfortunately, on quite a number of factors. And as previous speakers have said, one of those would be the clarity of regulations. So regulations, as we said right at the beginning, were not that clear. And obviously, police actions were not that effective. And because of that, confusion or the uncertainty very often also resulted in more friction between communities and the police. The other thing was also effectiveness of these decisions made by the existing structures depended on the clarity of the roles of the different role players. Because when they started working together on one specific common goal, at first they needed to understand what is it that the different departments work, what the responsibilities are, and how they would address their COVID-related mandates. And then the last thing is also the communication cascaded down to the frontline service workers. That had to be clear. But it's not just the communication to the enforcers that was important. It was also the communication and understanding of the communication in the community. In other words, the way that the community received the communication and how they interpret that, that was a big thing within the policing environment. Because if the community doesn't understand the regulations, obviously they will be confronted by law enforcers. If the law enforcers do not understand the regulations clearly, they will be confronted by the community who perceive that action as unfair. So we then also looked at the preparedness, and it surfaced again that SAPS was perhaps in a better position than other departments to deal with something like the pandemic, and specifically because they had structures in place, and they could learn and use the experience from the past, and maybe go back in history and see how things were done then, and use that to address the current issues. So many participants felt that the SAPS was in a better position opposed to that of other departments. When we looked at community mobilization, communication, and change management, and in short, the citizen responses, we realized that the communication of information to the public was a big thing. And many instances, the communication did not reach people in rural environments. So the message about COVID and the regulations, what to do and what not to do, would quickly reach your more affluent communities. But in your less affluent communities, people would tend to learn by word of mouth, or they would use and rely on social media, and that sometimes created an issue. Also in terms of court cases, when court cases came up and there were certain judgments made and it was reported, that changed communities' behavior or their response to policing. Public responses to the regulations, there was obviously resistance and conflict at first, and a lot of that has to do with understanding the regulations, both from the community and the police. And when you look at that, you find sometimes peaceful collaboration in environments where people are informed, where people have a better relationship with the police. But much of that has also to do with the way that the enforcement was done. So if in a community it's not possible to comply with all these regulations, you will be confronted by a police or an SANDF member that will tell you to keep your distance and. But over time, the police service then, and especially the army as well, realized that it's not that easy to enforce the regulations when the regulations moved from level 5 to level 4 and level 3. You will also remember that there was many instances on social media where communities deliberately went out to confront the police or the SANDF to get reaction. And I suspect much of that has to do with boredom. Then in terms of managing compliance, we had an issue there, or members experienced that there were specific compliance enforcement operations, and that seemed to work. So from station to station, people had different enforcement operations, and very often these operations were instructed from your provincial levels or from the national level, and that sometimes came in the form of static roadblocks between provinces to prevent movement between provinces. Also, your roadblocks to test and search vehicles for, for liquor, for instance, and tobacco, which wasn't allowed to be transported at the time. But there was a huge issue in terms of having the resources, because managing compliance means that if you put some people statically at the robot or at a roadblock, somebody else must still do your normal policing in the other environments. And that was put quite a lot of strain on resources. And I will talk about the resources a little bit later in the presentation. Something else that came up was...
I just want to warn you that you have 5 minutes left.
Yes, it's fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then the courts created a little bit of a challenge. And that was because of... I think between the police and the NPA, there was a little bit of a communication gap, in the sense that the courts did not want to enforce or continue or follow through with fines or charging people. So the police enforced, but nothing after that happened. So also we spoke of complaints earlier on, and complaints there were centralized and investigated like any other complaints, and feedback had to be given back in 48 hours to the complainant. So if we look at partnerships, for instance, civil society was involved. There was initial criticism because the social partners could not be involved in the initial phase during level 5. And that is the CPFs and NGOs, because of the restriction on movement. But later on, they became more involved in the jocks and the station structures, where they could participate in decision making and how to deal with the enforcement of the regulations. There were some disappointments, and that is specifically in terms of there seemed to be a preoccupation by the police in terms of the enforcing the regulations of the Disaster Management Act, and then where the police then neglected issues such as gender-based violence. Overall impact assessment, we looked at expanded mandate. The police had to engage in a balancing act. How do you deal with the COVID responsibilities, but also to enforce the normal policing, or how do you continue with your normal policing? It had a constrained capacity, which the police then tried to alleviate through rotation of members, and also using people or police officers who were in the administrative environment to work in the front line. Psychological impact was there, and that's for the police officers, where they experienced loss or death of colleagues, and eventually colleagues, because of the fear of contracting the virus, started creating a little bit of distance between each other. In terms of crime, the policing environment transformed, we know that, and that is because of the strict restriction on movement, sale of alcohol, and so on and so on. But the policing in some settings stayed the same as always. People thought that, or police officers thought that the regulations were just an added focus. So they didn't really focus on anything else. But there was continuation in terms of awareness campaigns, which included the Disaster Management Act regulations. And then again, we found that there was a dramatic impact of alcohol on crime rates, where there was strict enforcement of that, but the police also confessed that they struggled to fully enforce these restrictions. And in some instances, there was also even an increase in crime. So we know that there was strengthened collaboration at different levels, national, provincial, district, and local level. Also, mostly leadership provided at the forums by SAPS and the SNDF. And then again, there was huge support for the coordinating structures of the joints and the JOCs. But there was a concern that there was perhaps too many of these structures which created confusion. In terms of technology, we know that there was police were suddenly used or forced to use technology, and we're not always so keen on doing that. But there was also a greater efficiency at the meetings where we dealt with any operational matters. Communication was an important aspect because we not only had to deal with sending messages through, we also had to counter fake news or even misleading news. In terms of conclusions, we looked at conclusions on a sectoral integration and coordination level, human resources, digital and equipment readiness, and practicality of regulations. So the first thing that we realized is that a network approach with cross-cutting ties within the public sector, as well as strong linkages with community-based structures and non-governmental organizations emerged. So robust integration and forceful coordination driven by political will, administrative capacity, and robust mechanisms of accountability is required. Working on these three preconditions would be of strategic importance to the criminal justice sector and its constituent parts. COVID-19 necessitated the experimentations with multitasking, and that is in terms of human resources. Also, a very important one, considering the top-heavy organization, its large proportion of workforce assigned to administrative tasks, there's a rethinking necessary in terms of human resource allocation. Where do they need to work? I don't want to go through everything. I just want to highlight that because of the regulations and its uncertainty and when it's not clear, the police became the target of frustration, and in some communities, police were even attacked physically. So all in all, when we look at it, we have made recommendations. There are more pertinent recommendations for the police and also in terms of other departments, but it's impossible to put everything and present everything here. But perhaps the final note is the message that we should leave in the community. The study showed that there's dedication of all role players in wanting to protect and serve the country. And this is not just the police, it's the army, it's service workers, it's different departments, it's academics, everybody. And it shows that there's a positive attitude, a positiveness in the country, which gives everyone hope. But the study itself, I think, will serve as a valuable baseline for future research on topics like, for instance, the steady expansion of illicit entrepreneurs during lockdown, as many people that were previously law-abiding suddenly turned to more criminal activities where they started smuggling liquor for themselves or selling between friends and so on and so on. And that is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much.